In life's journey, we must seek to reflect, learn, and grow. Welcome to the Road to Rediscovery with your host, Aubrey Johnson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Road to Rediscovery. I'm your host, Aubrey Johnson. The Road to Rediscovery is about reflecting on life lessons to learn and grow from them and to take it to the next level and help others who are struggling through dark times. My special guest has moved from India to the United States to obtain his PhD in Communication Networks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a longtime technologist with a massive heart for community. In addition to being the founder of two IT startups, he's been behind the start of numerous community groups aimed at organizing people for systemic change. He's also part of Long Island Together, a collective group that organizes around education, immigration, and social change. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Raju Rajan to the show. Hey, Raju, how are you today, man?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for asking, Aubrey. Very good to be on your show.
Oh, well, thank you. It's so good to have you here. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to sit and chat with us here. So when it comes to the career that you decided to pursue and moving from India to the United States, was this a background that you were dead set on pursuing, or did it happen by happenstance that drew you to this profession?
It is somewhat happenstance, somewhat choice, is what I
Hmm.
would say. I came here actually to get a PhD in mathematics. I
Okay.
was, a student of mathematics. I really loved the subject. I came here,
Hmm.
but as I went through and did my master's, I realized that, you know, the jobs were harder in mathematics.
Hmm.
You really had to, uh, go beyond teaching to do a lot of research, and it was very intimidating. At a certain point, I said, you know, maybe I'll try engineering. At that point, I had not considered engineering, and I went into electrical engineering, which was very mathematical in nature. So
Right.
essentially, I really, cheated my way through. I can barely change a light bulb. I know a lot about the
Engineering.
mathematics of communication networks, but
Uh-huh.
my wife still laughs at me and saying, "Hey, what kind of an engineering degree is that?"
Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you. So, have you always had this heart for community? When it comes to your upbringing in India, what was community like for you there?
It's very interesting, right? Because India, when I grew up, we were the next generation after independence, right?
Okay.
So after independence,
Mhm.
my parents were sort of maybe 5, 10 years old when India became independent. So
Mhm.
they were the first generation, and they raised us as the first free generation in a independent India.
From birth, right? Gotcha.
Right. So yeah, from Britain, right? And so nationalism was very strong, right? I mean, it was always a force about, hey, we need to, now that we have this country
Hmm.
all to be ruled by India, by Indians, we need to make this a great country. We need to make this a egalitarian country. We need to reform our society in so many different ways. We need to become scientifically advanced. I mean, so there was always that colonial inferiority complex about, hey, maybe you're not good enough. But at the same time, there was all that aspiration that came out of enlightenment and nationalism, and wanting to be great again. So I grew up in that milieu, and so there was that was always a part of our upbringing. It was very powerful in the media. My parents were very committed to it, and funnily enough, that was the origin of my community organizing, was very
Hmm.
much in that nationalist vein. And when I came to this country, I landed up in Wisconsin, Madison, as you all, as most people who are familiar with it know, is a hub of progressive activism. There, it has been, the site of many student movements, women's movements, gay rights movements. I mean, it's been really very powerful in terms of community and organizing. So it was a
Hmm.
very different awakening for me, coming to this country and then connecting with traditions here, which were very different from my traditions.
I see. Yeah, that would be a tremendous shift, I would imagine, because of what you were accustomed to. in growing up in India and the sense of community there and the sense of commitment, right, to countrymen and not being inferior to from a technological standpoint, and not just saying, hey, we're independent, but actually embody independence, right? Which means, hey, we have great schools, we have great professions, we have people who have homes with vehicles, and kind of like a long time ago they called it the American dream,
Right.
right? But just an ideal type of lifestyle for raising a family, no matter what country you're in, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, right. I mean, and
Mhm.
India always has had a rich spiritual tradition and a religious traditions. It
Absolutely.
has had community and organizing and political traditions,
Hmm.
and it has had scientific and educational traditions. So it was a very rich set of aspirations with which I was raised.
Hmm.
And it's a country of
Yeah.
like everywhere else, there are lots of stories to tell.
Oh, of course, of course. Can you give us an example of just one of the extreme contrasts in terms of culture or how people interact with each other that you were used to seeing growing up in India versus what you were first introduced to when you landed here in the United States?
It's a very simple example, right? Like
Hmm.
when we were young boys and we used to hang out, putting
Hmm.
your arms around your friends, hanging out with your friends, physically touching your male friends was not a
Yeah.
big thing at all.
Right.
You come to America and you see that, it
Mhm.
almost signifies that you're gay, right?
Yes.
It's kind
Yes.
of like very different, like walking with an arm around a friend, right? Of
Right.
whatever, in India, the funny thing is you wouldn't walk in public with an arm around a person of the opposite gender.
Oh, I see.
Right? I
Yeah.
mean, because it was like, oh, is that your girlfriend? I mean, even if it was your wife, you would not do that in public because it would be not the appropriate thing to do. I mean, I guess
Right.
things have changed now. It's not a big deal now, but
Mhm.
definitely, 30, 40 years ago, that was definitely the issue. Whereas on the other hand, your same gender friends, you would absolutely, I mean, yeah, you would hug them, you would put your arms around them. There was nothing to it. And it was
Mhm.
completely, right? I mean, the script was kind of flipped here.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. So I appreciate you sharing that with us, Raju. I am familiar with UWM. I lived in Wisconsin for 3 years. I was in Madison for one, Milwaukee for two, and of course, this was during my middle school to high school years. And when I became a freshman in high school, obviously the discussions of college came up, and the University of Wisconsin, Wisconsin,
Mhm.
as in the Badgers. That was we were talking about possibilities of maybe me going there, and then Marquette, if you're familiar with Marquette,
Yep.
yeah, was another, and of course UWM.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm familiar with that area, and although it's been like over 30 years ago, but still,
Very,
it,
very intense sports teams, all of
yeah,
them.
yeah. Sports teams are very intense, and the one thing I did not know or was aware of, and maybe it was just a different time, was the activism that you mentioned. Okay, I wasn't in those university, village, college circles to see the activism, say between 1980 and 83, which were the years I was there. Okay, now it might have been there, you
Mhm.
know and the time frame that you were there, you definitely saw it. And I'm glad you shared that with me. I really am, man, because um I don't know, I just felt a lot of pressure in the theme of racism the 3 years that I was there, especially the first year and a half. Just a lot of racism, me being a man of color, and just moving up there with my family. It was tremendous. And so, um, in hearing you say and talk about the activism my first thought was, why would there be activism there? I had nothing but racism when I was, there.
Yeah.
But times change, and so activism's everywhere, just about, especially after last year with the social injustice and
Mhm.
a lot of people passing or dying at the hands of authority figures and so forth. So thank you for sharing, what you've experienced and around the university time frame. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Was exhilarating.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. I bet. A very interesting year. I'm sorry, interesting chapter in your story, I'm sure. So let me ask you this: when it comes to your studies, and if I may ask, um, your citizenship,
Mhm.
were these things that you were doing in parallel regarding pursuing your citizenship while studying at university, or did that come later?
It came much later because initially
Mhm.
I thought I would go back to India. I mean, again,
Okay.
very much raised in the nationalist tradition. I wanted to go back to India, and I said,
Right.
I'll study here. I'll do some things for a few years,
Mhm.
and then I'll go back to India. Was my always my plan. So I just kept putting off.
Gotcha.
Even after I graduated, I got a job doing research for IBM in their
Oh, really?
labs. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, I was in IBM doing research in their labs. At the same time, some of my best friends were out in New York City
Mhm.
organizing the taxi workers. So I'd work till late in the night and then drive over, and then we would
Wow.
hang out, like do the night shift work.
Yeah.
And then I
Yeah.
would go back and go to sleep and then go in late to work because research, you didn't have to go into like 10 or something like that. So um,
Right. Right.
yeah, so I love that lifestyle of coming then to New York, being in Westchester, but then being able to easily ride into the city, hang out, and do a lot of work with some of my friends who were South Asians,
Hmm.
fellow South Asians of progressive mindset, who
Yes.
said, hey, let's not buy into the American dream just in terms of like moving up, moving out into the suburbs,
Right.
buying that home, rising up the corporate ladder, but let's turn inward and look at the other portion of our community, which is the struggling immigrant community. They came here legally or without documentation or with documentation, but they're part of the working class. They are, they face an America which is very different from the corporate America I was seeing during the day,
Right.
right? So it did make a big difference to me. The work of especially several of my fellow activists who
Hmm.
were working organizing people across lines of race, gender. I mean, so for example, if you take sort of cabbies as a whole in New York City, for example, it's people of who is it like Jamaican Americans, it's
Right.
Pakistani Americans, it's Bangladeshi Americans, it's Indian
Uh-huh.
American, it's African Americans, it's so you really have to work in a and really it's no longer, it doesn't matter where you came from, you're still driving that same shift, you're still facing the same issues of racism, you're still facing the issues of the cops and
Yeah.
and a lot of crime and and an uncertain future. So it kind of is a melting pot in that sense of tearing away some of our, sort of bringing out the commonality in a lot of our experiences. And I think that again, America is amazing for me from that point of view. Like the kind of people that you meet and the kind of relationships you can have and the kind of stories you can tell and share. That's just amazing.
Yeah, no, it totally is. And you touched on a key part there, Raju, when you referenced relatable, connecting with people with relatable stories, right? Stories and circumstances and situations that has happened to you, that they can relate to maybe something that they're going through now. Excuse me. So, and I want to touch on that here in a minute. If I can just first quickly ask, what drew you to New York after graduating from UWM?
It's always been, it's I grew up in a city that's Chennai.
Mhm.
So for me, having 4 million people around me is like a security blanket.
Really? Okay.
No, it's just the cities are all their own countries, what I feel like. I mean, if anybody
Mhm.
tells me, how's China or I'm like, you go to the big cities, especially the big melting pot cities of the world, whether
Yes.
it is Paris or London or New York or
Mhm.
Mumbai. I mean, they're all essentially, their heart is essentially the same. Right?
Yes. Yes. I got you.
They're
You
their
know,
own thing.
I'm sorry.
They are their own,
Th- yeah,
continent.
they're their own entity, right? I mean, it's
Exactly.
yeah, no, for sure. And I am a huge proponent of living in a multicultural society, right? And that's the direction, that I feel this country's headed. I think this is the direction that a lot of places in the world is headed, right? It's not one dimensional or two dimensional anymore, right? It's multicultural. So yeah, so I appreciate you sharing that, man. Now, with relatable stories, okay, that you can share with immigrants coming in of something that you've gone through or something that they're telling you they're going through, and it sparks a light bulb in your head, and it's like, you know what, I went through that too. Let me share with you what happened to me under those same circumstances and how I responded to it. you know um in working with your colleagues and your friends in making that trek to New York, what were some of the things that you have encountered or endured um, as an early immigrant, early in your time, once you came to the States, that was something that an immigrant you have worked with was going through?
There's a lot of, first, I think when you come here, and especially as a sort of as a student, everybody's poor, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Essentially, you're poor and you don't know it. But on the other hand, right, you can do a lot with a little, right? So it's the first, the immigrant mindset is you constantly change everything back to your local currency, and you
Hmm.
say, oh my God, a dollar, it's 75 rupees or
Hmm.
4,500 yuan or whatever it is that you convert it into, and the money seems a lot more precious,
Yes,
right? You're like,
yes.
you're like, oh my God, why are people giving away a dollar for that? I mean, I'm like,
Hmm. Yeah.
I could get 6 coconuts back home for that,
This is
whatever.
coconut. No.
So you're constantly converting, especially when you're early on, and you
Yeah.
know how hard that money was earned. Especially if you're like being sponsored or you brought that money over, you inherited some of that money, whatever. You know how hard somebody worked to save that money. So
That's right.
you constantly have that, I wouldn't call it insecurity, but that awareness of um, being very privileged,
Yes.
and the awareness of how much you can stretch that thing with, right?
I
Um,
got you.
so that's one very um, obvious factor, I would say, that I see as a commonality between people who came into this country, especially from third world countries, that I just definitely see. Um,
Nice. No, that makes sense. Um, Raju, and I'm not speaking for all the Americans. I would never do that or attempt to do something like that. But just from my experience and different people here from the states that I've interacted with, I don't think a lot of Americans actually know, you know, all the obstacles and curves and turns and bends and challenges that someone from another country, or say even a third world country, go through to to come to the United States, right? It takes money to travel, obviously, and travel safely, and
mhm.
it takes obviously money once you set foot on the ground. And unless you have a direction or location to go to once you land here on U.S. soil, you're just standing in the middle of a big city wondering, okay, what do I do now, or where do I go now? And I think a lot of people here in the States are familiar um, with immigrants from, say, Mexico, crossing the border, and the border patrol and all that stuff, or even people defecting from Cuba and the life risking um, uh, boat ride they have in small kayaks and canoes, just risking life and limb to make it to the United States. Can you just share just a brief description of the difficulty that someone would endure in wanting to achieve that dream of coming to the United States?
So I would not speak personally simply because, there's such a wide disparity of immigrant narratives. And in
Right.
my case, I feel, especially when in comparison to the people you talk about, I
Mhm,
feel so privileged, right?
mhm,
I
mhm.
landed on a plane ticket and I went to college and then I got a good job. And,
Yeah.
to me, there was irrespective of struggle, when you put your struggle next to somebody like that,
Right.
that has
100%.
trekked across multiple countries, brought, their little kids and little ones across the border,
Yes.
walked into a place where they don't, I mean, I had the advantage of speaking the language, of not speaking the language, coming into this country with like a hope, dream, and a prayer, and maybe like an address of some relative somewhere, finding them, and then just paying the bills and making ends meet. I think when I put my experience next to somebody like that, I just feel so overwhelmingly privileged,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
and definitely I think that we all need to do to give back and help people like that. And
Yes.
part of, as you had said, like, the reason we formed Long Island Together. So in 2016, the first thing that happened when Trump was elected was we said, holy cow, what happens to our immigrant brothers?
Right.
What happens to
Right.
that family that came over with, like, a 2-year-old in their arms? The husband works in a restaurant and the wife works in, maybe cleaning houses or something like that. And the
Yes.
grandma takes care of the baby. And what happens to them if one of them is snatched and sent back and the other person, I mean, just come back. Imagine not knowing whether you'll come home safely to your family or whether you'll be deported directly with no word or warning, with like one station somewhere. I mean, and this has happened to people where people
Yeah.
were picked off the streets and they were never seen again, right?
Hmm.
And what happens? Well, what do you say to the baby, right?
Right.
So when you think about the horror of what could happen to people like that, you really start thinking, hey, what can I do to make the world slightly more rational, sympathetic, caring place, right?
Yes.
It
Yes.
doesn't have to be that brutal, and it doesn't have to be that horrible. And so protecting the most vulnerable among us from that kind of harm, I think that's kind of how I think about it, both in terms of my privilege as well as,
Hmm.
whatever little struggles I've had, right?
Gotcha. Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of passion and empathy that I detect and feel from how you are describing Long Island Together, and the inspiration behind it. A lot of times, um, there are fortunate things that would inspire a good change. And then there are unfortunate things that happen that inspire change. Now, whether it's fortunate or unfortunate can often be subjective,
Mhm.
but but I think the important key here is that whatever the change is in whatever in whoever's uh, uh, view, it's the fact that it's driving some sort of change for the better, right?
Mhm.
And it sounds like what you guys are doing for Long Island Together, you're really impacting people's lives in a positive way. And so with Long Island Together, Raju, do the people you interact with feel a greater sense of community and not just being out there alone when they're part of Long Island Together?
So yeah, so there are two threads to what we do with Long Island Together. My wife, Sonia Arora, has been a steadfast. I mean, she's one of the founders, and she's been so active, and she's 5 times as more passionate than I am in how she organizes.
Hmm.
Right. early on, her sense was like, initially, all of our sense was, oh my God, we need to do immigration clinics. We need to protect people from ICE raids. We need to form networks. We need to help people go and, whether if they have court dates, accompany them so that they don't get snatched, provide them with a sense of psychological security, provide translation. I mean, so we kind of like did the obvious protective things. But as we got to know the community better, the needs of the community started percolating. So as we held listening sessions, as we made friends, as we made fellow organizers, so essentially you move from the point of, hey, I'm doing this for that community to, hey, they are my friends and we are doing this together, right? So that's kind of the transition that happens very quickly when you reach out and start working with somebody else, right? I mean, they stop being just the passive beneficiary of your efforts to somebody who has agency in themselves, and soon they're organizing and telling you what to do. And that's great, that's correct. That's the way it needs to be, right? So one of the things that came from that community very early on was saying, hey, you know what? If ICE raids are going to happen, they're going to happen. If we're going to get snatched, we're going to get snatched. But we are here for our children. And you know what? Our children's education, especially the summers when the school is out, we don't have camps, we don't have enrichment activities, we don't have educational activities. What can you do in terms of providing? What can we as a community do in terms of creating better opportunities for our children? Because we are here for our children, right? That was the kind of sentiment that we kept hearing over and over again. And especially one really amazing activist, Anna Kondo, who's a good friend of ours, she was very insistent and persistent that, hey, let's do those immigration clinics. Okay, but what can we do for the children? And so we started doing, we started fundraising and sending children to summer camps. So this year, for example, we are sending almost, I would say about 140 to 150 children into summer camps by raising money through the community, through foundations, things like that. So whether it is sports camps, whether it is dance camps, whether it is science camps, whether it's taekwondo, right? So providing them with a variety of different opportunities that are, all the other suburban kids and all their, sort of the more privileged kids have access to and take as a matter of fact. It becomes a really touching experience. And then when we talk to the parents and the kids later, it is something that they remember. It is something they took away. It is something that is valuable. And every year parents are like, hey, are you doing that again this year? So that's become kind of a tradition in the town. And we are doing that. My wife, Sonia, is also working on creating a parents collective, a multi-ethnic parents collective, because, sort of PTA tends to be dominated by people who already have access and who already have, I mean, it's not knocking them, but they're doing the best thing for their kids as well. But they already have, certain privileges. They already have access. They know the language. They speak the things. They can work the system. But people who are outside the system, if you're a Korean mom, or if you're a mom who speaks Chinese, or if you're a mom who speaks Punjabi or Spanish, and you kind of like didn't quite know what was said, you don't know how to work the system, you're sort of ashamed to get up and speak because you don't speak English that good.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's all those people that you need to start getting together, because guess what? All our suburbs, I mean, it's, I'm sure, true of not Texas as it is of Long Island. All our suburbs are getting browner and, more diverse and, richer in language. So this is, again, like, I think of this as, I kind of am an optimist usually about these things, right? I just think this is the power of America. This is, if you talk about one American exceptionalism, one superpower that America possesses, it is of bringing people together, even if they have to struggle together,
right,
of bringing them together and then making something better out of what is, right? And that's kind of what we need to do every generation, get people together and struggle and then make the world a better place, right? So it's very unique in that regards. And I really, I'm in awe of how much I learn every day by working with people who are very different from me.
You bring up a very good point, Raju. I mean, when it comes to people of different cultures and races and religions and ethnicities coming together, and like you said, the one superpower this country has is the ability to bring those people together. And whether we come from the Eastern hemisphere or the western side of the world, um, no matter what color of our skin, we all have the same ideals, right? We all want a life for our children. We all want a future for our children. There's common ground for all of us, and so I just think it's absolutely tremendous of all the different activities that you just shared that you make and provide, in this community-driven effort, right? Having camps and other activities, and now you're pursuing an activity for the adults, and making it a totally interactive and experience, for immigrants to feel comfortable and assimilated, here in the United States. Um, it's tough enough having to go through the critical parts of immigration that you just shared earlier, and I'm so glad to hear that it's not just that you guys are covering, right? Like how to protect yourself from an ice raid, or if an ice raid happens, then we do this, we accompany them there, and it's not just those things, but it's the interactive things so that immigrants can interact with other immigrants in activities that you have for Long Island together. So, do you see the potential of something like this? Um, I work for a Japanese company, and so we use a lot of Japanese principles and expressions. Okay, um, so I'm going to say yokaten. Do you see an opportunity of this to be yokaten to other areas in the United States? And yokaten basically means you take a proven method and you duplicate it in other areas for continued growth.
Absolutely, absolutely. I really think that, look, it's not it's kind of inevitable. All our, just look at where our population is, where our population is growing
Hmm.
in terms of color, in terms of demographics, in terms of
Hmm.
race, language. It is inevitable that we would need these kinds of intersectional points where we are organizing together, and these models are very reproducible. And we liberally copy. Like if we find out that Austin is doing something, for example, one of the things that for Long Island Together, Sonia, my wife, is working on is the police reform on Long Island.
Hmm.
And one of the things she found out is, hey, the mental health model in Austin, they kind of they've organized really well, and any call to 911 doesn't automatically get routed to the police. There are, if somebody who's mentally disturbed is creating a ruckus, you want somebody who's capable of dealing with that on the scene, and not necessarily a cop with a gun, right? It's just common sense. So the fact that those models are being done in Seattle or Austin or other places, hey, we gravitate towards those, grab those, bring those in, and say, why are we not doing it here in Nassau County? So it's one of those things where we amazingly learn from one another, and naturally these ideas spread. The other, and I like to use that organic, natural analogy, right? I mean, because the other thing that I do is this startup, this organization that I founded together with a bunch of friends called ReWild Long Island. And this is very much, I mean, it's kind of like the other, this is less about immigrants. And this is, I always say I'm about native plants and immigrant people. So this is about how we treat our ecosystems, how we treat our landscapes, how we, just keep growing grass and pollute the atmosphere and pollute the earth, as opposed to going towards a more regenerative, biodiverse future, do things more sustainably, do things more organically, and do things that are good for the community as well as for the people in the community, right? So that's kind of like the other side of the activism we're doing here, is very much more environmentally driven, very much more oriented towards, it's not, as I say, it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white. If you plant a milkweed, a butterfly will be happy. it's not going to care that it landed on a Bernie Sanders yard or a Donald Trump yard. So that's another way of uniting people. What I've discovered is when you talk to people in terms of plants, in terms of their practices in their landscape, in terms of putting their hands in the soil, in terms of like growing things that are good for you, growing things that are wholesome for you and your kids and your community and for your ecosystem. People are willing to do it. They shut the politics. I mean, you can just put all the other politics and all the other dissension aside and really talk, gardener to gardener, homeowner to homeowner, earth lover to earth lover, and say, hey, this is something we'd like to do. And that's, again, another way of building community that cuts across the grain of the way we are supposed to herd together in terms of people who just think alike, right? So that's another way of organizing that we do here. And that's kind of really active, that's really taken off in terms of building much more rich yards and ecosystems out in Long Island.
Gotcha. ReWild Long Island.
Yes.
Man, I love it, and that's so true. It doesn't matter if a black person planted the seed or a white person, or if it's in a Republican's yard or a Democrat's yard. The butterfly is going to see a flower and wants to go there and pollinate it, or and so that's a great perspective. I really appreciate that, because it's that viewpoint, it's that level of mindset that I think across the board is the direction we all should be headed in, right?
Mhm.
It truly is. And so with that, I wanted to ask you, now I know, your both organizations, right? ReWild Long Island and Long Island Together, um, they, I'm sure there's a lot of visibility that your organizations are getting with I don't want to, well, the New York proper natives, right? The
Yeah.
people who are Americans, and people who have lived there and was born there and raised there. And so, what is the interaction with your communities and your organizations like, from a buy-in perspective or a participation perspective with the I guess the native population, for lack of a better term?
Look again, so that's the kind of thing that, again, right, coming from I'll go back almost to your first question, right? Coming from India, what is my perspective on this, right? So when I come from India, I see that very often, when I come here, people say, okay, you're brown skinned, you're Indian, but I know the diversity there, and I know people who are essentially racist or casteist or communal oriented or whatever. I mean, like, they look down on a Muslim, or they look down on a Dalit, or they look down on a person of another caste. So, you know the diversity, and that, it's not like love and hatred or somehow unique to only one community or caste. Oh, every ethnicity, every group can have people who hate and people who are capable of love.
Oh, yeah.
And, so whether it is Long Island Together and working with immigrants, some of the most passionate advocates have been, sort of people of privilege, sometimes white women, white men, people who are long time Long Island residents. Likewise, with ReWild Long Island, some of the most passionate advocates of how we treat the earth are people who, it's not there are people who come out and say, you know what, I've hated lawns all my life. I watched my neighbors, sort of do this insanity over and over again. It's such a breath of relief of, it's such a breath of fresh air that you guys are doing what you're doing, right? So, and I think the best way to break down some of these barriers is actually to get down and do work in the soil. So one of the things is, for example, let me give you a great example, which is just happening as we speak, right? So for ReWild Long Island, one of the programs we run is called the Summer Program to Fight Hunger and Climate Change.
Okay.
Just happened last year in the middle of COVID. I was talking to a couple of other organizations in town, which all work around the issues of environment and food insecurity. COVID was strong. There was no way of, getting food to communities, of growing food safely, and so on. Meanwhile, all our youth were sitting home from the pandemic in Zoom lessons and, quite unable to interact. So we said, hey, why don't we offer some kind of a scholarship or internship for young people to come out work in, we have some of these farms and growing areas. We have these preserves where there are native plants and invasives that you need to remove. Why don't we get an internship going where some of these young people do these things? Last year, we had about 12 interns. This year, I have 20 interns, 7 volunteers, another 15 adult volunteers. So we're close to like 60 people now, right?
Yeah.
And what we are doing over the summer is everybody has, sort of dedicated a certain amount. I mean, we say there's a minimum time commitment. You can't come for 2 hours and 4 hours. You have to put in at least 24 to 30 hours over the summer. And the youth are putting in 64 hours, right? So basically, we put in fairly tight time constraints and commitments. We're getting young people, we're getting old people, we're getting young people who are mentors, we're getting old people who are learners, all coming together, growing food. All the food grown through this program is donated to our local food pantry. We are going to be working in our preserves, in our local preserves, where a lot of the native plants have gotten overgrown with porcelain berry and kudzu grass and this and that and other. So removing those invasives, planting more natives, doing things for pollinators, planting milkweed, sort of like doing composting. So for the young people, it's learning all these different skills as to, hey, the landscape doesn't have to be landscape around your house, doesn't have to be lawn. That's just a failure of imagination for people to just build houses that look just like other people's houses, that just look like other people's houses, and their yards are populated by the same, rose bush and hydrangea and, azalea and rhododendron, right? That's a failure of imagination. Your landscape right outside your house could be rich, it could be diverse, it could be filled with pollinators and birds and bees and, butterflies and dragonflies and what have you. Your soil can be rich and you don't have to keep throwing stuff away. You could compost, reuse it. So giving them that imagination to be the kind of homeowners who respect the earth, who love the community, who are aware of food insecurity, who can grow their own food in their backyard. So you really want that generation of young people. And what we have is, sort of what is breaking the barrier down is the passion of our youth, right? I mean, when I see our young people come out, when we, for example, interview for them for this program, they're all passionate about the earth. They're all passionate against climate change. They want to do something for the community. They completely understand. I mean, like, many of those things which in the previous generation you had to, it's just heartening to see young people come. I mean, I won't say they're not racist or anything like that, but I'm just saying they are far less racist. They are far more aware of anti-racist movement, thanks to the BLM stuff that's happening, right? They grew up in an era where having that kind of consciousness was a good thing, right? So it's amazing, heartening to see our young people come out and now to give them the skill and say, hey, saving the planet just does not have to be on Zoom or does not have to be like, liking a post, some a Twitter feed from somebody, right? Yeah. It can be something like putting your hand in the ground, growing something wholesome. It can be digging the soil. It can be composting. It can be growing worms. It can be, sort of making bokashi, whatever. And so many different ways of contributing and giving them that imagination, giving them that skills. That's such a good thing. And coming back to your question, a full cycle, a lot of the, I would say a lot of the old gardeners, there are a lot of, sort of, I don't want to stereotype, but definitely there are a lot of older women who finished their, especially in Long Island, who became master gardeners in their later years. They just kind of like took gardening as a passion. And they come, and when they tutor the young people, it's kind of coming a full cycle. It's not about native or immigrant, or it's not about, have you lived in Long Island for 40 years or 20 years, or you just came in. It's really working together to make a good, better future. And I think you can do that by not thinking in, sort of like superficial political terms or just tagging people the way they look or the way you think they should be, but really challenging them to work with you and make a better future. That itself builds all these bonds and make this possible.
Gotcha. That makes all kinds of sense, Raju. And in the days that we are in now, with the emergence of technology, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and all this stuff, they could be easy distractors, especially, with our youth, looking at YouTube and seeing professional YouTubers and stuff.
Mhm.
And so I think the service that you guys are doing in teaching the youth, something that has been tried and true since the beginning of man,
Right.
right? Farming, reaping something that you have sowed, and eating and living from it, right? Sustainability, and it has to be taught to our youth because they are the future. After we die off, we don't want this to be a lost practice, right? Because if it's a lost practice, and over time, these generations who are the sons and daughters of farmers and they decide to do something else besides farm,
Right.
well, then you have a shortage, right, of that type of supply, and then demand gets higher, and then it's like things start to collapse, right, as far as the whole structure. So what you're doing is an absolute um, uh, awesome service
No,
for.
Aubrey, it's very much in line with what you do, right? The road to this rediscovery, right? And rediscovery is just basically looking at something that you thought you knew and seeing it in a completely new light, right? That's kind of
Yes.
how you rediscover. And I tell you, like the basic thing that I teach people, I would love to say that, for ReWild Long Island, what we want people to do is get on that road to rediscovery. And what that rediscovery is look outside your house and stop seeing things and start seeing living beings,
Yes.
right? Don't
Yes.
look out and see a lawn that's a carpet or a set of arborvitaes that are a fence or flowers that are just pretty for you. Put on the eyes of a bird or put on the eyes of a bee or a butterfly and start seeing things in terms of their value for somebody other than human beings, right?
Hmm.
A tulip bulb that came from, that was first wild domesticated in Turkey, then taken by the Dutch, and then they kind of like mass produce it in the millions and then ship it over. And then it comes like a little, what I say, a little plant Barbie, and you plant it in, has no value for the bee, right? I mean, it may look pretty to you, but for the bee, it could be like as well a plastic, it could be a pink flamingo on your yard. So on the other hand, you plant something that is native, that is local, and that has co-evolved with that bee, then that bee finds habitat, the bee finds sustenance, the bee finds, sort of the ability to reproduce itself. And so it's kind of like just that road to rediscovery in terms of looking at things a little differently. And they may be familiar things, but just because they are familiar does not mean they are a given. You can look at them anew and change the way that you relate to them and that change the way that that they are outside, right? So that's kind of really, I think that's my way of uh, interpreting our synergy with your podcast and the service you do.
No, I understand 110%, Raju. I do, and such a vivid description of what the road to rediscovery means in this context. I really appreciate you articulating that, and it's very clear to me for sure. So, Raju, where can people learn more about you and the great work that you're doing with Long Island Together and Rewild Long Island?
Google search ReWild Long Island is rewildlongisland.org,
Okay.
and uh, uh, Long Island Together is longislandtogether.org.
Hmm.
They definitely can visit our websites and connect with me, connect with any one of the wonderful other people. I don't want to take solo credit for any one of these things, which is a community effort by a lot of different people, but you
Hmm.
can connect with any one of us and join us and really help, or as you said, uh, replicate this in your own area. Wonderful.
Oh, fantastic. Awesome. Raju, thanks for that information. We will put that in the episode show notes for the listeners so they can access your websites directly from the show notes as they're listening to this episode. Raju Rajan, Thank you so much, man, for being on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation. I had a great time. I hope you'd be able to come back on the show maybe 6, 8 months later and give us an update on how things are going with the organizations.
Sounds wonderful. We'll have like a wonderful whole bunch of vegetable stories to tell you.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, by then we'll be harvesting, I'm sure. So
Exactly, exactly.
yeah, so I'm looking forward to it, my friend. I really am. I
Thank
really
you,
am.
Aubrey.
All right. And so now we're going to go into a segment I like to call Three for the Road. And in Three for the Road, I ask my guests three random yet thought provoking questions, challenging them to answer in 5 words or less. So, what do you think, Raju? You think you're up for it?
I guess so.
As ready as you'll ever be, huh?
Let's,
All right. Okay, here we go. Question number one, starting us off for Three for the Road. Name a sport that you think closely emulates social change.
League of Legends,
League of Legends?
esports, online
Oh,
gaming.
okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. I could see that. I could see that. That's worldwide now, right?
It's worldwide now, and it's
Yeah.
running
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure,
And
absolutely.
it's
And it's
and
millions
it's
of young
another
people,
medium of communication.
and it's so illustrative of social change in the sense that most of your listeners, most grown adults, will be like, "What did he say again?"
Yeah.
Right? And then here are these millions of young people who are doing nothing but like playing those, gaming those, and playing
That's
those.
right.
You know,
That's right. Awesome. Great answer. Love it. All right. Question number two. You, Raju, you become king of the world. You rule over all lands, all countries. Okay. However, you could only impose one law. One law. What would that law be?
mm, that's a one law and less than 5 words
Less than
long.
5 words. 5 words or less.
I'll go with no more lawns.
No more lawns. Okay, that's two to spare. That's great. No more lawns. Okay, that's a good law, and I think a lot of people would be happy that you made that law.
I'm sure a lot of people will be mad at me for having wasted all the other problems that I could have solved in favor of this. But I think we got to do something for the environment. That's really my thing. Is we always,
Yeah.
tend to do, and we have one thing to do or 5 things to do. We
Mhm.
think we do think of other people. That's great, but the environment always takes the bottom of the bucket, and it's
And it
time we
shouldn't.
started putting the rest of the earth first,
Right.
and ourselves second, at least in some respects.
Well, I agree. Our survival is because of the condition of the earth. And
Mhm.
if we just consume, and not contribute, then, it's going to be a bleak future in the next 50, 60 years, I would imagine. So I appreciate that. And yes, I think you may have kind of upsetted some of the hardware stores. I think their lawnmower sales will go down, but hey, at least the grass will go up, right?
Yeah.
All right. Question number three, topping us off for Three for the Road. Name a food that helps foster a thriving community.
Uh, I will go with uh, salad. Uh, and
Salad.
and the reason I'm saying that is because, again, when I think community, I
Hmm.
don't think human community. I think of my worms. I think of the things that grow in my compost.
Yes.
Again, that ecosystem. So I try not to waste all my food waste go into my compost.
Yes.
And to me, that's kind of the most thriving community that is there. When you take the layers up, whether it is flies, little worms, insects, beetles, the nematodes, the bacteria, the fungi, it's just such a rich community. And for me, uncooked food that goes in there, you can just see how happy they are. I put a cucumber in, my worms are all over the cucumber. I put a watermelon in. Yeah, you put watermelon rinds in, they're all over it. So for me, the food that fosters community most is salads.
Okay, no, that makes sense, and it really makes sense now that you've explained it in that context, right? Because all the stuff that you put in your compost, that is a community, right? I don't know, from a botanical sense, maybe.
It's kind of like it is the same community that lives inside your stomach. The reason you're able to digest salad is not because you have an ability to digest salad, but because there are millions of other anaerobic bacteria in your gut, your microbiome, that sits there and digests it for you. The same soil, the same bacteria or very similar bacteria live in the soil. The soil is not very different in process from what happens within yourself. So the inside and the outside are not, diametrically opposed. They are in some sense part of a continuum. So it's kind of like when you think about it in those terms, you really don't feel alienated from nature. Yes. Don't feel like, oh, that stuff is gross and I'm somehow clean.
No, you're right. That's an amazing perspective because a lot of people on the surface would say, wow, that stuff is gross. It's decaying, it's molding, it's breaking down. Well, every microbe and every organism in there has a purpose, right? And so that's all part of that ecosystem you're talking about. So
when you reflect on the fact that there are 10 times more bacterial cells in your body than human cells, you realize you are a community. You are an ecosystem yourself.
Gotcha.
Right. You just don't think in those terms. You're forced to think in very narrow individualist terms of myself, the human, as opposed to the bacteria, it's just like you are part of it. It is part of you. Yes. Scientifically. It's just that you choose not to be aware of it because it grosses you out.
No, so true. So true. I really appreciate that perspective because you've enlightened me with that perspective, with that insight. And my wife, who is a huge gardener, with her compost that she usually gives me the task of throwing things away in it. I look at it, I smell it, and I churn it, and I'm like, oh, this is gross. Well, now I'm going to have a new lens on it, right?
Please.
I'll definitely have a new lens on it. All right, Raju, man, I want to thank you for coming on the show, man. I really enjoyed our conversation, man. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. Really wonderful, great podcast, and thank you for having me.
Oh, no, my pleasure, man. My pleasure. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening. And guess what? The Rediscovery Roadmap course is now launched. That's right. If you would like to take an introspective approach to personal growth, then you will want to take advantage of the Rediscovery Roadmap online course. For more information, just visit roadtorediscovery.com/course. That's road, the number 2, rediscovery.com/course. Also, and even more importantly, if you have a loved one who seems to be at the end of their rope, going through very dark days of despair, major challenges and struggles, they just don't seem to know or have any direction to turn, I humbly ask that you please share this show with them because on the road to rediscovery, we want our listeners to know 2 things. Number 1, you're not alone. And number 2, there's always hope. The road to rediscovery, it's a movement, a revolution. And guess what? You are now part of it. We're all roadies on this journey of life, and it sure feels good having you on the road with me. Thanks again for listening. We'll chat again soon.
The Road to Rediscovery is an AJ Shark production.